Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. After a little foray into Jonah last week with Stephanie, which I trust you all enjoyed, we're back in the gospel according to Mark. We're picking up right where we left off 2 weeks ago when Jesus inaugurated his public ministry by casting a demon out of a man in the synagogue. When I say that we're picking up right where we left off, I mean that quite literally. Not only is it the very next verse 28, 29, but according to the story, it's the very next moment. This morning's gospel reading begins as soon as they had left the synagogue, or immediately they left the synagogue and entered Simon's house. Immediately. If I could choose one word to sum up Mark's gospel, it would be just that, immediately. The gospel, according to Mark, is the work of a breathless storyteller trying to get everything out as fast as they can. The 16 chapters of this gospel feel like one big run-on sentence careening toward Jesus's death and resurrection. Case in point, that Greek word euthys that we translate immediately occurs 51 times in the entire Greek New Testament. 41 of those 51 times are in Mark's gospel. In the first chapter alone, that's right, folks, we are still in chapter 1. Mark tells us about 10 separate episodes in Jesus's life, and he uses that word immediately 11 times. In the Greek, it sounds something like this. John the Baptist is baptizing in the wilderness. Jesus comes to be baptized, and immediately as he comes out of the water, the heavens are torn apart and the Spirit descends on Jesus like a dove, and immediately the Spirit drives him out into the wilderness to be tested. And then John is arrested, and Jesus comes back and he starts preaching, and he walks by the sea and sees Simon and Andrew fishing. So he calls them, and immediately they leave their nets and follow Jesus. And then Jesus sees James and John, and immediately he calls and they follow. And then immediately on the Sabbath day, Jesus enters the synagogue and teaches. And immediately there's a man there with a demon, and Jesus casts the demon out, and the people are amazed. And immediately they tell people about Jesus. And immediately they leave the synagogue and go to Simon's house. And immediately they tell Jesus that Simon's mother-in-law is sick, and he heals her. And that evening he heals many more people. And the next morning he goes off to pray. But Simon finds him and says, everyone's looking for you. So Jesus says, let's hit the road. And they go to Galilee, and a leper comes to Jesus, and Jesus touches him. And immediately the leprosy is gone. And immediately Jesus warns him not to tell anyone, but to show his clean self to the priest. And the word about Jesus spreads. Phew. I don't know about y'all, but right now, this gospel makes me feel exhausted. I can't handle any more immediately right now. What with the constant news alerts, phone calls, emails, we are an overstimulated and overwhelmed people. There's always one more thing to do, one more bill to pay, one more person to call, one more doctor's appointment or cancer treatment, one more issue on the construction project, one more decision to make, one more I to dot or T to cross. And by the time we're done with that, another email or 3 has come through and we're back to square one. I've been keeping my phone on silent or at least vibrate recently just to avoid that surge of cortisol that comes with the alert sound, or what I've come to call the PTS ding. I honestly don't know how there is so much for us to do in the middle of a global pandemic. But it seems that everyone I talk to is overwhelmed by something right now. Maybe this immediately paced, sensory overload, too much, too fast ministry made Jesus feel exhausted too. Maybe that's why he got up so early and went off to a deserted place, trying to catch just a moment to pray. Perhaps not surprisingly, given the number of immediatelys used, Jesus doesn't get much alone time in Mark's gospel. We are told of exactly 3 times that Jesus is able to steal a moment by himself, and this is one of them. And even then, he is interrupted. Simon barges in on Jesus and accuses him, "Everyone is searching for you." David Michael Bender, in his commentary on this passage, points out that Mark comically demonstrates Jesus's inability to find isolation by his very definition of the word alone. Later in the gospel, Mark writes, "When Jesus was alone, and those who were with him, along with the 12 disciples, asked him about the parables." So for Jesus, apparently, alone includes the presence of at least 14 other people. I listened to an interview this week between professor and vulnerability guru Brené Brown and psychologist/relationship specialist Doctors John and Julie Gottman. They were talking about the toll that this pandemic has taken on couples and families. Brené Brown openly admits that after 30 years of marriage and 2 children, raising 2 children, the pandemic has hands down been the most difficult season of family life for her. And the Gottmans agree that across the board, they are seeing terrible stress between people, couples, parents, and children. Relationships that functioned well because both individuals were really involved in the world in their own separate ways are now stuck in the pressure cooker of a single dwelling. Many of you have told me that you feel overwhelmed by the intense togetherness with your family or your spouse during this time. And many others of you have told me that you feel oppressed by the sheer loneliness of it all. Many of us are longing for more human contact, for a return to crowds and handshakes and hugs. We want to see our families, but we're unable to travel. We've lost loved ones and can't hold a proper funeral. In the interview I just mentioned, Julie Gottman names that people are at wit's end trying to sustain connection with one another in a way that feels fulfilling. There's a huge difference, Dr. Gottman says, between a 2-dimensional screen that we look into and the energy of a human being in front of us. For many of us, it just doesn't cut it. The same day I stumbled across this interview, my partner sent me an article from the Huffington Post entitled, "It's Not Just You. A lot of us are hitting a pandemic wall right now." The author talks about why the past few weeks of the COVID crisis have been particularly hard on our individual and collective mental health. We're hitting 1-year milestones, and the end is still a ways off. The vaccines are offering us hope, but the unequal and perplexing distribution makes us feel angry. And the uncertainty over how long we or our loved ones will have to wait for a vaccine makes us feel scared. We've been in fight or flight mode with our stress responses going nonstop for almost a year now. And the adrenal stimulation and fatigue is more than our human bodies are built to withstand. We are, to a person, overwhelmed and exhausted. What is making you feel overwhelmed and overburdened these days? Where are you longing for a bit of respite, of gentleness, of relief, of the Jesus who says to us, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." In the face of all this, Jesus offers us the example of a pause, an intentional moment to reconnect to ourselves and to the one who is the source of our being, to get grounded and hopefully, for at least a few moments, to stay that way. Jesus goes to a deserted place, but perhaps even more importantly for us, he takes a moment of deserted time. Jesus makes space in all the demands of his life and ministry, in the middle of all those immediatelys, to just sit and be. Even as people surround him, he steals time to be alone. And even as he sits by himself in the wilderness, we know he is not really alone at all. He is in the presence of God, sitting, waiting, listening for a whisper from on high. And the good news today is that Jesus invites us into this pause with him, into the space between breaths, the sound between the notes, the eye within the storm, the quiet center of a chaotic world. Because it is precisely in that pause, in that space between immediately, between the cracks, that God comes to us. That is where God can enter our hearts and speak to our souls. Some call it prayer or meditation. Some call it Sabbath or sabbatical. You who have served as deacons, elders, or committee members have heard me refer to it over and over again as a holy no. It is a moment to put aside all that is not essential and to recognize that the only thing that is essential is God. So let's take a moment right now, actually. We are Presbyterians, which means that silence lasting longer than 3 or 4 seconds inherently makes us uncomfortable, but let's try it. Close your eyes if you'd like. Maybe place your hand over your heart or on your stomach. Quiet yourselves. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in the Spirit of God. Breathe out all the demands of immediately. Breathe in the space to be alone. Breathe out the frustrations of constant companionship. Breathe in the presence of God. Breathe out that oppressive loneliness of solitude. Breathe. 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 God is here. God is with us. God will never let us go. Amen.